Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. No David today. He is finishing his book, which you all are going to pre-order as soon as that's possible, I'm sure. Joining me once again is Thomas Kennedy. Thomas has been with us a couple times. He's one of my favorite people to talk about a number of, Florida issues, but also the border and that sort of thing. He's currently...
Your favorite Florida man?
What was that?
Your favorite Florida man, perhaps?
I would, yeah. I think you could earn that. You're Left Reckoning's #1 Florida man. Currently at policy at the Florida Immigrant Coalition. Thomas, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me back.
It's great to have you. It's actually great to have you for this first story. Ron DeSantis, we haven't talked about him in months now. I can check my watch. It's been a while. He's back in the news for a amusing reason, maybe a troubling reason for folks who are less jaded and want to see good governance. But what is Ron DeSantis in the news for?
Yeah, and it makes sense that you haven't talked to him about him in a couple of months, because he's largely receded into the background of American politics. I've always said that he would end up like a Scott Walker figure, right? Somebody that flew a little too close to the sun, was at the right place at the right time, and just didn't have the juice to keep going. But yeah, he's back in the headlines, and it's because of his wife's quote unquote charity, scare quotes, charity. So they set up this thing called the Hope Florida Foundation that was basically supposed to help low income Floridians get out of poverty, right? Through those like financial literacy workshop grifts, that nonprofits and local governments love pushing, on people. But it turns out that, investigative reporters did their due diligence. Let's start with Hope Florida. They claim that they have helped 30,000 people get out of poverty. Turns out that they have helped no one. Like literally reporters from the Tampa Bay Times, Miami Herald, other outlets have furiously tried to find somebody where they've actually helped. And everybody that has gone through the program, through the nonprofit services, basically says that it's a referral service to other providers, and that Hope Florida just provides, quote, moral support, right? So what does actually Hope Florida do, and what does it serve as? It's basically a money laundering operation for the DeSantises. And this is how it worked out. There was basically a settlement regarding Medicaid fraud that resulted in $10 million, $67 million, actually, $67 million for the state of Florida. And that's money that's supposed to go back into the coffers to be appropriated for the public benefit, right? Theoretically, in good governance. What happened is 10 million out of that 67 million, $10 million, good chunk of change, was funneled to Hope Florida illegally, and then at the behest of Ron DeSantis' then chief of staff, James Uthmeier, who's now the Attorney General of Florida after DeSantis appointed him, that money was directed towards dark money groups, basically these political committees that used it to then funnel it to the Republican Party of Florida's coffers, and an initiative fighting a recreational marijuana ballot initiative that was voted on last year, and that failed because DeSantis had already steered other public funds towards fighting it. So just to recap, I know it's convoluted. There was a public settlement supposed to benefit Floridians. They stole $10 million off of that money, directed it to DeSantis' fake chair, and then they directed it from there to political committees benefiting Ron DeSantis and his then chief of staff. They have literal public records showing that he was involved in directing that transfer.
And, this first crossed my eyes. It was a Republican, I believe, politician who was calling out DeSantis. So, it's like when David talks about Texas, a very Republican-dominated state, you'll get, it's bad when fissures start happening within the party.
Yeah, so that would be Rep. Andrade, this guy is not like, what they would call a rhino. Like, he's a very, very Trumpy, like far-right Republican. So the political context here is important, because going back to what we first started the interview with, that DeSantis is no longer in the headlines and flew too close to the sun. I mean, this guy really bullied the state legislature here during his first 5, 6 years in office until he ran for president and failed. And he didn't make a lot of alliances, and he cracked a lot of heads during that time span. And now, the chickens are coming home to roost. He just doesn't have a lot of friends. And as his time in the governor's mansion sunsets, I don't know if you've heard, Matt, but he wants to run his wife to replace him, right? And Trump has already endorsed the heir to be Byron Donalds, another Trumpy congressman, as his pick. So, obviously, this is a political maneuver by the Republicans in the legislature and the Trump-aligned Republicans to basically kneecap DeSantis' wife, Casey DeSantis, kneecap DeSantis and tell him, listen, man, like, your time is past due. Go into the sunset, get some think tank presidency, or go grift at some university president position, but your wife is not going to be governor of Florida,
Right, because DeSantis is term limited out, right? And that's why he has to keep his eye on what his next sort of landing spot would be as well. I mean, that's fascinating stuff. It's the sort of thing we could look at if you want to feel optimistic and think maybe these people could, because Trump endorsing Byron Donaldson, I mean, do I have the right understanding? He's kind of he's a Republican, but he's a lunatic, right?
Byron Donalds?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's just like a grifty MAGA Republican. I mean, he's been going, what's that guy, Benny Johnson, right?
Yeah.
He's been going with Benny Johnson to troll these like Tesla takedown protests. I mean, just absolute clown shit,
Yeah.
That's the type of guy that we're talking about, that wants to be governor of the state of Florida, one of the largest economies in the world. You know what I mean? Just a guy that's hanging out with Benny Johnson doing live streams outside of Tesla takedown protests. It's pathetic.
How would you, I still remember when Gillum almost beat DeSantis for the governor's race, and we're at the end of that. Well, I guess, how long does DeSantis have? Does he have
2026?
2026, right. How would you sort of judge the effect he's had on Florida politics?
It's a really difficult and broad question to answer. But, I think that the pandemic really, really scrambled the political scene here in Florida. It led to a lot of young people moving out of the state. It basically became a Republican sinkhole state. A lot of boomers, a lot of tech people, a lot of Republicans, fleeing, like northeastern states and masks or whatever came into the state. And also, just of the Florida Democratic Party is a completely incompetent operation. So I think it's both demographic and political context trends that have benefited Republicans, while also the Democrats have just been unable to both provide a coherent, message and a coherent, competent operation, like political operation.
Yeah. So let's turn to immigration now. And I'm curious, what you're observing. Florida, Texas kind of gets a lot of the border attention these days. Florida, in the 90s was sort of the original sort of border front line. Wherever you feel like going with this question, I'm curious what sticks out in your mind.
Yeah, I can give you the Florida perspective. What's happening here is the resurgence of what's called 287G contracts, right? So the 287G contracts is something that is actually was birthed in the Clinton era because of a 1996 law called IRARA that updated the INA, which is the Immigration and Nationality Act. So Section 287G allows municipalities to come into contracts with federal immigration enforcement to allow greater cooperation, mostly police departments, having local police do the job of ICE officers. So in Florida, in the last few years, we've had numerous state laws that make signing into those contracts not optional, but mandatory, right? So, and they're only mandatory for counties that operate a jail here in Florida. But DeSantis his administration is really bullying local elected officials under the threat of removing them from office, which he can technically do. He overstretches his constitutional authority, but he does overstretch it. He's bullying municipalities and even public university police departments, like the University of Florida and Florida State University, from signing into these contracts. So you're having this proliferation of, again, local police cooperating with immigration enforcement to come into our communities and terrorize immigrants. And, for example, I don't know if you saw the news, Matt, but last week we came upon a case of a US-born citizen that was arrested by Florida Highway Patrol and detained under an ICE hold for over 24 hours. And, the family contacted us. We were able to eventually free him after having a flurry of elected officials at the local, state, and federal level say, contact ICE to tell them they had made a mistake. But it's really troublesome. And just this past weekend, we had an operation across the state that the state officials claim detained 800 immigrants. And it was done, again, in cooperation with Florida Highway Patrol. So I think it's really disturbing. Obviously, police as an institution is an institution that has many, many issues. But, I think the last thing we want out of police is for them to be doing the job of immigration enforcement, right? I don't think it's going to make our communities more safe. It's definitely going to make our communities less safe. People are going to be more afraid to report crimes. It's going to lead to overzealous police enforcement. And I'll finish by saying this 287G task force model, which is the model that deputizes police officers outside of the jail setting, was actually rescinded in 2012 during the Obama administration. And it was rescinded because there was, again, a flurry of racial profiling lawsuits across the country that were costing municipalities millions and millions and millions of dollars. So we've been down this road before, and we know where it leads to,
For folks who are maybe sort of adjacent to Dem policymaking, this is a very scary time. I listened to a podcast, Reveal, and they had an immigration expert. I can't remember who it is, but maybe I'll try to link it in the show notes. But they're talking about, the first Trump term, there was a lot of crossings that border enforcement had to deal with. So the sort of internal removal operations that we're seeing now, they couldn't really focus on. And kind of the untold story right now is all those crossings that we're told are an invasion are actually low. So that's why you can see all this stuff happening within the borders. That's happening. And you also finally see polling moving away from Trump's handling of this. Yeah, I'm curious what sort of guidance you would give, or like people who are wondering, like, how do we address this issue now? Like, what are the main sort of things you think from a policy standpoint that America needs to actually do once we get through this sort of hysterical racism witch hunt thing that we're doing right now with immigrants?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, this is like a really basic answer, but obviously we need comprehensive immigration reform with an actual path to citizenship. The last time we've had immigration reform in this country was with a path to citizenship was 1986 under Ronald Reagan. This was back then a world that didn't have the internet and public's like cell phones available for the wider public, right? Just a completely different world, So that's number one. We need to legalize millions of people that have been living here for decades without any sort of path to citizenship or protection. The other thing is, I think states need to do some sort of worker authorization program for people that have been living there. Here in Florida, we have really, really big labor shortages that are acknowledged by the state's own Office of Economic and Demographic Research, right? And in the state legislature, they were just trying to pass a crackdown on E-Verify. They were trying to expand E-Verify, which is to basically check an employee's legal status. And they wanted to make it so a company that employs one employee has to use it. Right now, it's if they have 25 or more employees. Why would you do that in a state that has acute worker shortages, where agricultural companies and construction companies are having to use worker visas to bring workers from abroad? You already have a domestic pool of workers. You know what I mean? This is causing inflation. It's causing supply chain disruptions. So, I think we have to make sure that we address the people that are here domestically, been here for a long time, that we get them legalized, that we get them worker protections, that we get them citizenship. And then we sort of address those worker shortages by doing worker authorization programs for people that maybe want to come here, work, and leave, visa programs, etc. But it's like what Bernie Sanders said earlier this year when there was that whole blow up fight between Bannon and Elon Musk over the visas. We need to first address the workers that are here domestically. And when I say that, I don't mean just American citizens. I mean American citizens and immigrants that are here that are trying to stay here permanently. We need to address that problem, and then we can go state by state and say, where are the gaps? Where are the shortages? Which industries need to be, augmented? And then we can look at visa programs and guest worker programs and worker authorization programs to address those gaps. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's sort of a lot that's been on my mind is, the way Trump used this sort of political economy concerns to basically mask white supremacist policy. But the truth is, like, when you look at the people, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a union worker, right? Alfredo Juarez Zeffirino up in Washington State, literally a farm worker activist. Right. Like, these are people that are like, the idea that this is something about suppressing wages and not actually coming through for bosses who want to drive people under the ground and continue to exploit them is something that I think needs to be drawn home to people. Like, that we shouldn't view these people as rivalrous, especially like you say, like, there needs to be a sort of understanding that this is not done. Trump is not doing any of this to protect wages or improve the economy of America.
Of course. And look, it's as simple as this. It's basic economics. Immigrants, I always say this, I repeat this over and over again. Immigrants do not take jobs away from people who are already here. In fact, they generate jobs because they put back their earnings into an economy where the total number of jobs historically grows with population. If you look at it like that, it just doesn't make sense that immigrants would take people's jobs. And in fact, most economists, when they're looking at the effects of Trump's mass deportation agenda, they say that it's going to not only decrease GDP, decrease growth, increase inflation, but it's going to cause job losses. I think, Aaron Reichland from the Immigration Council was saying this yesterday. Out of 500,000 deportations, that's going to result in 44,000 job losses for Americans. Why? Because it means that their businesses are going to close. You know what I mean? It means that places that they're going to work are going to lose revenue. They're going to have less revenue to hire other people. It just makes sense that if you're sucking so many people out of the workforce, that's going to have negative impacts that are going to reverberate and hit fellow workers. You know what I mean?
Yep. And it's so ironic given, this sort of purported idea that we're going to, reshore manufacturing, which, it'd be nice to do. I think it's going to take more than tariffs. When we actually were, producing things in factories and, develop, like when Trump looks back to the 19 teens and stuff like that, it was a lot of immigrants in those factories, right? The idea, like, that whole idea that a person coming to this country is bad for us economically is ludicrous. We shouldn't want, there's actually a problem where, the whole open borders thing, the worry I would have would be that we would continue our foreign policy, continue displacing people in other countries so that they could come here and get into our system. Like, it's very strange to me how blinkered this whole conversation is.
Yeah, and I just want to make a point, not to get too out of subject, but Crystal Ball always says this in Breaking Points. And I think it's such a good point. There's nothing inherently good about working a manufacturing job or in a factory or the nostalgia that people have in America for those jobs is not necessarily that they are manufacturing jobs or factory jobs. Is that in that era where sort of that's romanticized, there were a lot of union benefits and labor protections and just, policies from the New Deal that made those jobs like a good middle-class job, right? But people like Lutnick and Besant and, folks from the Trump administration, they want to restore manufacturing jobs without those labor protections and without the union membership,
Yeah, 100%. And I've seen graphs that show like sort of, yeah, once we lost the unions, it turns out, or union density fell. Turns out those jobs weren't what we imagined they were at a certain point. And um, I guess I want to say this is a hopeful sort of episode, but hopefully the fever's breaking. I think there's probably a lot more harm that's going to be caused by this immigration. Abolish ICE. Do you think that's back on the table? I've seen a lot of people sort of ironically say like, oh, those people were sort of right. I've always been of the perspective that it's been a sort of awful Department of Homeland Security era sort of organization. Do you think we could roll this into taking out? Should we put that back on the agenda?
I mean, we have Bill Kristol on our side now. Did you see that tweet?
That's what I'm saying.
I think obviously he said it, he was a little cheeky but I mean, he did tweet. He said, where do we get our apology? Where do the apologized people get our apology? I mean, look, I don't know. I think, and you were getting at this earlier in the conversation, but the American people are kind of fickle with their opinions, and I think obviously the opinion polls are showing that they are becoming friendly towards immigrants again, and they are horrified by the excesses of the Trump administrations. And Democrats again are just such a feckless party. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Hakeem Jeffries was directing Democrats to not take any more trips to El Salvador. I don't even understand why, because it's a political winner in polling data. So I think it's a hard sell politically, but is it the right thing to do to abolish ICE? Yes, absolutely. It's a bloated, resource draining agency that's an active threat to the civil rights, not just of immigrants, but of all Americans. It's part of this just post 9/11 surveillance infrastructure that was built up to repress, again, the rights of Americans. It should absolutely go.
Yeah, the cost of it is one thing. If there's something worth doing, I'm not super interested in how much it costs. There's plenty of rich people around here that we could tax. But as far as the waste and the stupidity and the cruelty of what we're doing, and I think how much it costs should be maybe is something that I should maybe get better at publicizing. But Thomas Kennedy, policy at Florida Immigrant Coalition, at Thomas Ken on Blue Sky and Instagram. Anywhere else you want to direct people's attention, Thomas?
Maybe just our podcast, which you've been on. Why Are We Like This?
We'll have that link to Why Are We Like This as well. Thanks, Thomas.
No, always good talking to you. Take care.